the establishment of the first global commercial circuit in a sustained way, when we have the route of the Flota de Indias, or the Carrera de Indias in the Atlantic, together with the Galeon de Manila on the Pacific, and then we have the Spanish Empire as a trading empire consolidating an idea of globality. Now, my question is, between 1488 and 1565, a space of global governance was constituted for the first time. There's evidence to that. It was an empirical achievement, I know. What was the meaning of such a globality, and how did it come about? And what I try to trace, and I'm using the idea of novelty in this particular moment for that, is how is it we came about with this idea of globality? And what I'm going to be saying today relates to this wider problem. Now, when I was planning this lecture, I realized that I could speak for many, many hours about it, and I tried to circumscribe it as much as I could. So I'm going to mention some things in passing. If you want me to elaborate more on that, just tell me later, and I'll be very happy to dive on that. I've taken this lecture in a very clear, as an invitation to experiment a little bit with a thesis that I'm trying to develop, and I'm going to be guiding you through that. So the problem of novelty had to do with thinking beyond the oikomene. And thinking beyond the oikomene related to engaging with a lot of things that were not known. But there was a tradition of knowledge that informed this way of seeing the world, which starts to be relativized quite drastically towards the end of the 15th century. In 1503, after the return from his second trip to the Americas, to the Indies, as was labeled by the Spanish at the time, Americo Vespucci wrote a letter to Lorenzo Pietro de' Medici in Florence. The letter apparently is from 1501, really, but the publication is from 1503. And it's very telling about the conscience that he has about experiencing something novel. And something novel in terms of not having the knowledge resources or the experience to relate with what he is currently encountering. So I'm going to read this very long quote. I know it's very bad practice, but I find it quite revealing. And I quote, "Part of this new continent lies this new continent," and there's already a conception, he has a conception of the continent, "lies in the torrid zone beyond the equator towards the Antarctic pole, for it begins 80 degrees beyond the equator. We sailed along this coast until we passed the Tropic of Capricorn and found the Antarctic pole 50 degrees higher than horizon. We advanced to within 17.5 degrees of the Antarctic Circle, and what I there have seen and learned concerning the nature of those races, their manners, their tractability, and the fertility of the soil, the salubrity of the climate, the position of the heavenly bodies in the sky, and especially concerning the fixed stars of the 8th sphere, never seen or studied by our ancestors. These things I shall relate in order." And I add some emphasis. Now this text is very interesting because it tells us a lot of what is taking place at that moment. The reference to the torrid zone makes it's a reference to the Aristotelian understanding of what happened beyond below a particular latitude, and he was of the belief that it was inhabitable land. It would be far too hot, but here he was, and there was life, right? And he's recognizing races, and he's using the term race, which is very interesting at the time because the Spanish, or the Iberian conception of race in that particular moment had to do with religion, had to do with the Christian and the non-Christian, the Jewish and the Muslim, and here he's talking about race in a slightly loosened way, and the heavenly bodies. And on this one, I would like to zoom in for a moment. We have for navigators in the Mediterranean and in the close Atlantic to Europe, the reference point was Polaris, the North Star. But what these sailors start to recognize is that, of course, Polaris is not seen anymore. you start identifying other constellations. And José Antonio Maraval, who was a historian of ideas in Spain in the 1950s and 60s, he wrote a very influential book called Antiguos y Modernos, The Ancients and the Moderns, where he claims that Iberian sailors had made a claim to be the first moderns. And the basis of that claim was that they were exposed to constellations that the ancients did not know. And because of that, they claimed the right to start creating a new cosmology, which allowed them to dissociate from classical knowledge and speak about the novel. Now, I took that as the starting point for my investigation, and very quickly realized that, of course, people like Vespucci were talking exactly about that. And you can find something similar in navigators from Portugal who reached Brazil, for example, referring to something similar. So what you start realizing when you sail down those latitudes is that what matters now is not Polaris. You cannot see it anymore. And therefore, the reference point that you used in order to find your location doesn't work. I'm going to be talking about location in a very critical way in a moment. So what to use now? And then they started looking at the constellations, and they come up with this idea of the Southern Cross. As any constellation, it's an idea, right? It's stars. And this South Cross is visible up to 25 degrees north. So when Columbus reaches what today is the Bahamas, for instance, you could start seeing the South Cross from there onwards. You couldn't see it further north, but you could. And the second and third trip started going towards the south. This became a reference point. And of course, it's a cross. It's a Christian sign, right? So you start identifying heavenly bodies, and you start identifying based on the imaginary of the world that you believe in, right? It's a form of life that starts finding new bearers in order to find ways of navigation and so on. So I find this quite interesting. Vespucci had charted several stars during his second trip in 1501, and he made a description of this, a book on these new constellations, and he gave it to the King of Portugal, and the King of Portugal at the time, Manuel I. And in this other text that I related to a moment ago, he mentions that the king never gave it back to him, and that it's lost, that he hopes to recover it. And that's the last mention we find about that book. It was a description of the constellations. Now, the very fact that he engages with this description of new constellations, for me, is evidence that he is claiming the right to map the skies in relation to the need to be able to navigate those waters. And I'll say something about that in a moment. Now, what we start finding in this process, and this is not me speaking, but Maraval, he starts describing an emerging epistemology, which moves away from an epistemology of recurrence to an epistemology of creation. And recurrence has to do with finding what was already known, finding what we knew from the ancients and the classics. And a very telling example of that was finding monsters in the New World, right? So, but you had, or beasts, but in the Middle Ages you had very clear descriptions and catalogs. You had bestiaries, right? So you would go through the bestiaries and say, yeah, but this green thing with the big mouth and doesn't really relate to any of the beasts that we had a catalog for. So let's call it an alligator or crocodile or something like that, right? Something that we didn't know about. Maybe that's not the right example, but some new animal that you found, or a plant indeed. So we have an epistemology of recurrence, which could be explained through, for instance, Plato's paradox that he posed in Meno. How can I be able to find out what I want to know unless I already know it well enough to identify it? So this forecloses the possibility of novelty, right? You're always going to find what you already know is there. A bit like this tradition of science in which we militate, in which we have to formulate a hypothesis that then we're meant to go and validate or falsify, right? And there are several examples that Maraval engages with in order to demonstrate that there was this epistemology of recurrence at play, and Horace was one of them, of course. in his statement of marvel at nothing, Nicholas. This is the only true rule to follow. So if you want the stability in the world, you just have to find what you know. It's a security of knowledge. Cicero is another author that is usually cited in this respect, and in the Republica he speaks about the role of tradition as a way to legitimize thought. So there is a reason why it's there, and therefore we should follow that order. But now there's a shift through this kind of engagements with the world, and it's a shift towards an epistemology of accounting for the new. And Vespucci speaks about, there's a quote that I take from his text. He says, "In that hemisphere I saw things incompatible with the opinions of philosophers. A white rainbow was twice seen about midnight, not only by me but by all the sailors." Now he's using the word hemisphere here, which is quite interesting in relation to the time in which he's speaking. So there is a move towards trying to come up with the resources to claim legitimacy towards what is being encountered. And of course, this creates a lot of difficulties. If you're going to innovate too much, and if you're going to go against the canon of the church, for example, you might get into trouble. Don't forget we had the Inquisition that could come for you and this kind of things. You have to be very careful for this. But interestingly so, in relation to this, what I've been finding now is that some of the describers of the new nature that are being found are actually priests. And a big percentage of the text is dedicated to making that text compatible with the scriptures. So very long discussions as to how Thomist thought, for instance, Thomas Aquinas, could be used in order to legitimize what they are saying. A way of saying, well, we can say through the saints, but it's us who is speaking, right? And that was a very interesting maneuver that I find, because what we know of this period is very little if we focus on writers in subsequent centuries. Francis Bacon, for example, refers to knowledge produced in this period as papist, as backwards, as dogmatic. And in fact, what you find is a lot of innovation which is carefully crafted not to disrupt very quickly an established order. Now, the thesis I'm pursuing by looking at novelty in this particular moment has to do with the problem of novelty in relation to the emergence of the Western global in the 16th century, revolving around two allied empirical problems. So I'm starting from the position that I recognize novelty to be an empirical observation. This is nothing theoretical. It's grounded on direct experience by those who are experimenting something which they were not acquainted with. And the first one is the problem of location and the practice of localization. The second one is the problem of synchronization or of temporal simultaneity. And I'm going to say how this evolves in a moment. And the two problems materialize, they come together in the challenge to be able to identify longitude at sea, which was a pressing problem, and was a problem which was a practical one. So the problem of longitude at sea was that if you were familiar with navigating within the Mediterranean does not have a very wide span of latitude. And in terms of longitude, well, it's partly constrained. You have some problems with navigation there, but you're never too far away from a coast either. If you get terribly lost, eventually you're going to bump into something, right? You have wind currents, which were quite well known. You had cartography to navigate in the Mediterranean. And once you start sailing in the Atlantic, you have completely different problems. You have wind systems that you're not familiar with. You have sea currents. And you just don't know where you're going to get. And you have other kinds of difficulties. So location, knowing where you were, became an acute problem the moment you start sailing in the Atlantic. And of course it had empirical challenges. Sea currents, as I mentioned, winds, magnetic declination. was a massive difficulty, because it was not just about being able to identify where you were in relation to the sun, for example, but you start noticing that depending on how you move, the declination of the compass with regards to the sun is going to change. How do you account for that? And it was an observation that, for example, Columbus made in his diaries, for which a solution came slightly later. This was a massive empirical challenge. There are all kinds of logistical challenges which you might anticipate. Naval supplies, or how do you supply a ship for a trip that you don't know how long it's going to last? And there were some calculations for that, assuming that the trip would be much lower. You probably know about the mutiny that Columbus almost experienced at some point, didn't come to a full mutiny. We have issues of ship design. So the vessels that Columbus used for his first trip were 2 caravels and 1 now. And the caravels were rather small vessels which had lateen sails that would allow you to sail against the wind. You could tack. But the now was a heavier ship, which is mostly for transport. And it had a different kind of sailing and rigging, of course. That didn't allow it to do certain kind of things. The caravel was considered to be the ideal ship for exploration, but you couldn't carry too much on the caravel. And I've been reading quite a bit about naval design in this period, and how they managed to sail against the wind. Well, nowadays, if you do dinghy sailing, you would be very familiar with what you do. You just put inside, you put what do you call it in English? The sword in German. Anyway, you
keel.
Sorry?
Keel.
Well, the keel would be fixed, right?
Rudder.
No, the rudder would be the steering, right? The centerboard. So if you're gonna sail against the wind, you put in a centerboard that compensates for not sliding towards the wind, right? But how did you do that in a caravel? They didn't have a keel. They didn't have anything of the kind, because the whole idea of the caravel was that it would be fairly flat on the bottom. So you could go into very shallow waters, and therefore you could use it for exploration. And one of the fascinating things about the caravel, and this started to become an acute problem with the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America, which is 100 and something years ago, of course, was that they tried to make replicas of the caravels. And there were very good descriptions on whatever surfaced over the water, and they could recreate that, but they didn't have much knowledge about what happened under the water, right? The keel and so on. And the replicas they made, they couldn't sail against the wind. They were incredibly unmaneuverable, and the caravel was known for being a very maneuverable ship. So that became almost like a mystery. And they've been able to recreate it lately by looking at old cartography and how caravels were depicted in the old maps. They haven't come to the point of understanding very well how it works, but they believe that instead of having a centerboard, they would actually have to move the weights of the cargo towards the back of the caravel, so that the caravel would go like this, and this would act as the centerboard, more or less, as a keel, right? And then, but the problem with these machines really, was tacking. It will take the whole crew to be able to shift the sails from one side to the other. It created all kinds of logistical problems. But anyway, it's fascinating to see how they managed to do it. Now, another thing that has been fascinating, and here I'm drawing on my sources, which are sailing itineraries that were written in that period on how to get to places. These were basically instructions on how to train pilots that could get the ships to the Indies based on the experience of experienced pilots. Now, pilots were mostly analphabet at the time. They couldn't read and write. They didn't have to in the past. But now this starts to become a bit more technical, right? And once you have found these lands and you want to colonize them, you need to have many more people to steer the ships there. So what they decided to do was to collect the knowledge of these pilots, almost like in an interview, a Socratic kind of method, and write them down. And we have the Itinerario de Navegación of Escalante de Mendoza. And it's fascinating because he describes very well how to get to places. as a result of that, he was never allowed to publish that because it could fall into the competitor's hands, right? So he had a manuscript. So you have descriptions on how to get to the Canary Islands and what to do once you see the Canary Islands. And there's one description where you get to the first island, then you take a bearing of I don't know what direction, and you count the third island. Once you get there, you're going to see the figure of a woman in stone at the end of the island. You look for the right breast, and then you take a bearing, and then sail for 2 weeks. So it's very descriptive in how you deal with this kind of things. Another thing that I found fascinating in one of them is the role of the pilot and what the pilot does in order to govern the ship. So the pilot should not sleep, should sleep as little as possible. And if needed, the pilot should sleep during the day. Because at night, he should be making sure that they're following the right route. And the position of the pilot on the ship was by the mainmast, with his thigh touching the mast, the mainmast. And I was very curious about that, so it took me to reading more about the design of the ships and so on. It happens that, of course, these ships were wooden, right? And there would, as you know, with any wooden structure, so in a wooden house, you hear the ceiling creak all the time in the floors. They're always working, right? But that's information. That gives away something happening. And you were sailing not only with the trade winds, that had to be discovered, of course, but also with the sea current. And if you got off the sea current, you had trouble. So you have to make sure you were on it. And sometimes you cannot see the sea current. So how do you do it? You feel it. You feel some vibrations. So it's sensorial experience. It's direct sensorial experience. And all this starts to be recorded, written down as practical knowledge on how to get to places. So I once interviewed a naval historian at the Naval Museum in Madrid, knows a lot about these trips, and I asked him, okay, so they got to these islands, they left some people there, they went back to Spain. How on earth did they manage to get back to the same islands, right? They couldn't locate it in the coordinates that we're familiar with these days, never mind GPSs, right? And he was saying that, and I said, how did they do it? He said, we have no clue. We don't know. We can only guess. And he says, well, our best guess is that these sailors were very finely tuned to the elements. Their sensorial experience was very coordinated. And he says, well, they could read the waves, they could smell the air, they could feel the vibrations, they could observe at much longer distances than we can these days. Now, I remember visiting the Maritime Museum in Sydney some years ago, and seeing a ship just from the 1950s, and this was a war vessel, and the bridge was open. There was no glass, right? The bridge where you have the command was open, and I thought, why is it open? Then I realized that I was told that from the 60s onwards it became closed, and the reason why it was left open was because the commanders needed to sense through their own experience, right? Skin is a wonderful sensor, but of course we cover it completely these days, right? In those days you would really expose yourself to that. And I say this because there's a lot of knowledge that you can sense that nowadays we have outsourced on remote sensors, different kinds of sensors, which are digital mostly. But that would be the talk of a different, that would be a different talk. Okay, well, we have all kinds of things with food and water, diseases at sea, order aboard or on board. I always have that discussion. But location became a relational problem. Now, you would know location based on the sciences of the time, and cosmography was one of them, for sure. The idea of cosmography was that you would be able to understand what happened here with what happened in the wider system. Location of the different celestial bodies, and the understanding of the sphere. So the work of Sacrobosco, for instance, was still very current at the time. You start finding a lot of treatises on cosmography emerging in the early 16th century, training these pilots, but also other people, especially state bureaucrats, on how the world worked, geographically speaking. But we had a very clear, we had two tensions in terms of how this science could proceed. One had to do with this division between theorists and practitioners. And a typical example was that there were two chairs, two professorial chairs on cosmography in Spain at the moment. One was the old chair of cosmography at the University of Salamanca, which was taken to be the center of theoretical knowledge. And that chair was particularly concerned on writing about the sphere as such, celestial bodies, and things which were highly theoretical, and tried to find mathematical ways of dealing with these issues. The second chair was created in the Casa de Contratación de Sevilla, which was basically a ministry that was established by the Castilian crown to deal with all matters related to the Indies. And it was a monopoly, a state monopoly, and they will deal with all kinds of things. One of them being the creation of a Padrón Real, which was a central map, an official map, which ideally would concentrate all the geographical knowledge that would be accumulated by the sailors and kept in one single place. And another role of the Casa Contratación was to have a piloto mayor. Piloto mayor was the one who would teach other pilots on how to do their job, and also had the monopoly on making the instruments with which these pilots would find location at sea. And here I'm talking about the astrolabe, and I'm talking about the quadrant and the ballestilla, which is, we're going to see an image of that in a moment. Okay, but we have this tension between theorists and practitioners. The chair in the Casa Contratación was meant to provide practical knowledge. And this is knowledge to power, knowledge for the service of the state. So anything that was being done there had to be of direct use. So social engagement, industry engagement, all that sounds very familiar these days, right? Whereas the Salamanca one could sit in his armchair or be in his observatory, this kind of things. But the other tension we had here, it's a pity this doesn't work very well, but I wanted to represent here, we have these are images I put in the back from the Suma de Cosmografía from Pedro Medina. Here we're talking about the 1530s. And here on the back I have a calendar. Anyway, on how to find the height of the pole. But that's on the outside. Now the tension that I find here had to do with classic knowledge-driven theory. So how do we know the world, the globe? We know it through the treatises that have been passed on to us since antiquity. In this case was Ptolemy. And the tension here was, should the piloto mayor in Seville be schooled from this tradition, or should it be an experienced sailor? And the first piloto mayor was Americo Vespucci. So he was a very experienced sailor who knew how to chart things, who could take his own measurements and so on. And the idea then was that whereas Vespucci had been informed by this science, he could put the practical knowledge with the theoretical knowledge together. Those were the tensions within this science that would inform what this was about. Now, oceanic navigation and the problems of latitude and magnetic declination started to find practical solutions. But what we call practical solutions were very sophisticated instruments at the time. We have a central figure of which very little is known in Anglo-Saxon scholarship, which is that of Abraham Sakuto. Have you heard about Sakuto? It was, yeah, you have, yes. You a geographer? No, okay. Sakuto. And Sakuto was a very interesting figure because he was of Jewish origin, and when the Jews were expelled from Spain, he moved to Portugal. Eventually they were expelled from Portugal. But when he was in Spain, he was writing, and I think he was working at Salamanca at the time, University of Salamanca. He took the problem of magnetic declination was not a new one. It was something that had been known for a while, and in times of Alfonso X of Castile, 1350s more or less, there were some tables of calculations on how to know this phenomenon. Well, he took those tables and adapted them to his current time and created the tables that you could apply. Depending on where you were, you just had to be able to make adapt your current measurement to these declinations, and you would pretty much know where you were. But this was very difficult to use, especially for people who were not trained in mathematics. He was also known for adapting a very old instrument, which is known as the astrolabe, which allegedly comes from the second year before Christ in Greece. And the astrolabe was designed to be able to find your location, and your longitude, the longitude of where you were when you were in land. So this is an instrument that you have to hold, but it has to be static. If it moves, you have a very different reading. Now this is very useful on land, but if you're using it on a ship, it's a problem, because in a ship you never really have a flat surface, right? So he adapted this instrument to be of some use. And I say some use at sea because it was never completely accurate. I actually got a demonstration of this with a 16th century astrolabe in the Naval Museum in Madrid, and they showed me how to do it. And then they asked me to take a reading based on a light bulb that was around there. And I took it, and the other guy stood in the same place, took it, and we had like 5 degrees difference. You just imagine that at sea, right? 5 degrees exponentially. That's quite a problem. Now, this is quite interesting because there was an attempt to deal with the problem, and there were instruments that were being developed, and yet the problem was not completely tackled. I can move a bit quicker now because I'm running short of time. The second issue had to do with synchronization, and I read this to be an imperial imperative in a global economic order. Now, this is very interesting because the problem of latitude is being able, so the solution to knowing where you were in terms of longitude, was what is the present time in relation to the time of origin. And that difference would allow you to know where you were, west or east from where you were. So it's relational from where you started. So it's a relational reading, right? If you depart from London, it would be different from departing from Seville, right? And this is very interesting because once you start needing to know with great precision where places are, always in relation to a place of origin, there is a purpose for it. And the purpose in this case was that you start finding places, you need to locate them. Why do you locate them? It's the whole problem of definition. How do you define something determines how you're going to govern it, right? And if you're going to start having a system of direct or indirect but remote rule, you need to be able to know where those things are and where they are located and so on. The problem of temporality here I find fascinating because it denotes a wider problem of trying to synchronize the time of origin, in this case the time of Spain, in relation to the Indies, and it denotes the colonization of a temporal space. So you want to know Mexico, for instance, or New Spain, as was known at the time. You need to be able to govern it from Seville, and you need to do that in order to be. But you need to know where those things are in the distance and so on to be able to allocate resources, expect the Galeones coming, and so on and so forth. And that's an argument I cannot make just now. It's just to say that it creates an issue of synchronization. Interestingly enough, this is a similar moment when we changed the calendar in the West. We changed from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, which was not adopted at the same time all over the world. Many countries take it much later. And there's a time when we have different calendars taking place, being used at the same time. This idea of globality is not complete. Globality is basically an imperial idea, as I'm developing here, right? So we have the creation of a global, but it's a global in relation to an imperial order. Now, how do these two things come together in relation to the problem of longitude? So we have the problem of location, localization, and synchronization of time. And longitude, I theorize here, is really a problem of governance. It boils down to being a problem of governance. It is an empirical problem with global imperial implications. Now, being able to calculate longitude accurately at sea and land was central for the identification of what was later to be known as territory, the space of the sovereign. And I say later because there's a long discussion on the historiography of territory. It mattered for the localization of Christians and of the Christian faith, which was, as I said, a racial problem. So the big discussion in scholastic discussion in the early 16th century was, were the indigenous people found, well, the Indians, as they call them, found in the Americas, enslavable or not? And the crucial element there is, do they have a soul or do they not have a soul? If they have a soul, they're either Christians or Christianizable. If they don't have a soul, you can enslave them, as the Africans had been. So that created a big of a discussion. Eventually it was settled for, they have a soul, and therefore you cannot enslave them. And a lot of things have happened already by then. But localizing Christians or potential Christians was absolutely central to that imperial development and this imperial speciality. And of course the governance of trade, of economic spaces, which was later theorized, if insufficiently, as mercantilism. I'm not going to dive on that, but that's a fascinating part of the investigation. So novelty here, just to wrap it up and to finish, became an epistemological condition for thinking and acting a Western global. Around the problem of longitude, elements of novelty mattered tremendously. I mentioned the different constellations which started to be found. You needed reference points with which to navigate. You started encountering new people for which you didn't have a pattern of behavior, or you didn't know how to relate to them or what you could do with them. You started encountering new crops, for example. So big problem they had once they landed in these islands is we need to eat. Can we eat what the natives eat? But they found out that a lot of that food grew underground, but you're not allowed to eat that kind of food. So but they were alive, right? So they ate that food and they were alive. So maybe we also can do it, but if we do that, does that constitute sin or not? So it's a moral problem, right? We have a massive moral problem there. How do we account for that? How do we deal with it? I'm sure they ate it because they remained alive and so on, but this became a big problem for a very long time. Now, the problem of novelty materialized temporally in the synchronization of time in an imperial system of governance, and it legitimized claims to modernity and the right to create a new order of the real. And I want to emphasize on this last part on the order of the real, because it is not that there is a real out there. We see the real based on how we understand the world. But we can create a new order, right? Through observing differences in kind and differences in degree in relation to what we're looking at. So a very simple but extremely important observation in the 16th century, one that might be a bit too simple in at first sight, which I find very rich in the details, is that the idea of globality was an empirical problem. It has never been a theoretical element. It has always been a practical issue that we have dealt with. And I would like to leave it there.
Thank you.